Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the Buyer and Sellers Property Podcast. And this week, first thing I should say is I'm sorry about last week. We promised you a interview with Emily Cadmore of Fairstone Financial Services. Unfortunately, the regulators got hold of it and said that we can't talk about interest rates. And I know how much you want to talk about interest rates and what's going on. So we've had to scrap that one because Captain Clipboard said no, unfortunately. So sorry about that, folks, if you were looking forward to that. It was a great interview and we'll try and rehash it in another way. But today I'm excited to welcome a real industry stalwart, somebody who, if he doesn't know about it, it's not true. Michael Stephen Day. Mike Day, welcome on the show.
Morning, good to see you.
Good to see you too. And today we're going to talk about all things property. And Mike's a great one for a story and knows literally he trains estate agents and has been in the business for many, many years as director of large agency groups. He mentors agents. So what there isn't to know about property isn't, Mike's got it all. So, Mike, welcome. First thing I'd like to say to you is that it's lovely of you to come on the show because I know what a busy guy you are. But I wanted to talk first of all because I know this is with the cliff edge coming, as it were, of the first stamp duty holiday ending at the end of June. I see, one of the big headlines we've seen is that stamp duty receipts have soared to 1.196 million, making March the fifth biggest month for the Treasury since the income tax was introduced in its current form. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because we all expected that the government were going to receive less money, but it's that old adage about when you tax too much, people do less, and you tax less, people do more. It's interesting to see, isn't it? An interesting dynamic there.
Absolutely. I think you've just given the fact that it's produced some pretty incredible results, obviously, in March, which was the date scheduled for the initial end of the stamp duty holiday. And of course, what it's done is it's created or added to the demand that was already there, the pent-up demand that was already there, by propping up the industry, giving that incentive. And I think it's brought forward a number of transactions that would have probably happened anyway, but it's concertinaed them into a shorter time frame. Of course, that deadline has now been pushed back until June. And indeed, it's been pushed back until September, but at a lower rate because the current £500,000 zero rate runs now until the end of June, and it then halves to a zero rate of 250 until the end of September. So the government's actually done quite a lot there. But yes, what it has done is it's created greater numbers of transactions. So they're taking less per transaction, but making more overall. And I think it does indicate that what many of us think, and that is that stamp duty as a tax, the reason they like it is it's very easy to collect.
All too easy, yeah.
But the reality is that it probably could do with a reform in terms of how it's run. One of the things is, should it be paid by the seller rather than the buyer?
Well, yes. And of course, if you look at the housing's a problem for the Treasury, isn't it? Always has been, and always has been for governments. I mean, we get a housing minister every year virtually, don't we? They just can't get it right. They don't build enough. They don't know what to do. There seems a real disconnect. A friend of mine just a couple of years ago, who's in the building trade, runs quite a big building company, actually spoke to the then housing minister. And the housing minister asked if he would invite him onto a building site because he'd never been on one. And you sort of think, these people are in charge of housing in the UK. And it makes you realise what a disconnect there is.
Well, I think that's true. What you've got to bear in mind, of course, is that politics works generally in 5-year cycles. So a government gets elected and it's elected for 5 years, and sometimes less, of course, but, for 5 years. And therefore, a lot of policy decisions that get taken are short term with, at least half a view of, am I going to be re-elected in 5 years' time? And housing isn't generally a 5-year plan. If you're going to make massive infrastructure changes, house building, et cetera, that's not a 5-year program. People move house now every 20 years. Well, you could have 4 governments in the lifetime that you're in one property. So it's this balance between short-termism, which is political, and the realities of the market. And there is something to be said that elements of housing should be out of government and in the civil service in some way, shape or form, so that it is slightly depoliticised.
Yeah, absolutely. And that would smooth it, wouldn't it? Instead of having these peaks and troughs, which actually, people think professionals in the industry want these peaks and troughs, but actually what we want is slow and steady. We want people to have confidence to move and not feel like, they have to move tomorrow or they can't move tomorrow, don't we?
Absolutely. And I think, whenever governments of whatever colour and persuasion have intervened in the market, as the current government has through obviously unbelievable circumstances with COVID, but, the stamp duty holiday, you and I are probably long enough in the tooth to remember things like the end of dual tax relief in 1988.
Good old Myras, yeah.
And, and things like this, all of which boosted the market and in a short-term scenario. And then the market died on its backside subsequently. And now I think there is a difference this time, and I'm happy to talk about it. I don't think the market's going to die on its backside.
No, I agree.
But there's no doubt that it has been artificially boosted in the short term.
No question.
So, I'm not personally convinced that government intervention is always a good thing in a free and open market.
No, I agree, Mike. And I think one of the interesting things at the moment, we've got all this demand that's coming forward. We've got people that are buying, there comes a point in the cycle, in my experience, where natural greed takes over. We see our friends have bought this house in Cornwall and now it's doubled in value. And here we are still stuck where we are and we're enticed by that. And of course, the pandemic has changed things, I think, for good. I think there's a permanent seismic shift in the way that people can now work. One thing I do think, I don't know if you agree with this, Mike, but a lot of people, they look at these holiday type destinations. Lots of people that I'm meeting daily now are moving. They're moving to seaside destinations. They're moving to the Lake District. They're moving to, frankly, the middle of nowhere quite often. And these are people that are Londoners. They've never lived anywhere else. And I just think that when they realize that Costa's not round the corner, and by the way, there isn't an Aldi, and by the way, everyone wants to know everything about my business, I wonder whether they'll still be happy there. And then the office calls and says, actually, you need to come in 2 days a week. So I think there'll be a lot of people that make this decision a little bit hastily.
I think that may well be true. And there's, undoubtedly, COVID has obviously caused everybody in whatever situation to sort of slightly reappraise their life and everything about what they're doing. And there's been a much greater, certainly short-term emphasis on, well-being and all that over finance and everything else. There's always been a trend out of London to an extent. That's been accelerated by COVID, as you've just described. But I think that there will also be a trend back into the cities because people do want people around them and whatever. Now, you don't want people around them if you're frightened of catching COVID, but if things are back to some form of normality,
absolutely,
then a lot of people do want people around them. And the working situation is an interesting one. During this last year, I've had super fast fibre installed at my office here. I work from home, and what a difference that's made. Now, and of course, that infrastructure is happening more and more. So the ability to work from home for people is much greater. All businesses have learned to cope. But there is this miss of the interaction with the members of staff around the coffee machine or whatever.
The banter, we missed it,
Yeah, and there'll be a balancing act here. Whether people go back to working 5 days a week in Canary Wharf, or whether they perhaps move a little bit further out, give themselves a slightly longer commute because they're only going to do that 2 or 3 days a week instead of 5. I think these adjustments are happening.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? And a lot of people that I've spoken to working for large companies have seen their KPIs, their key performance indicators, go up massively since they started working from home. And of course, the firms had no idea that this might happen. So you can see why, in my view, this shift is more permanent than some would suggest.
Yeah, sorry, Ken. I think the whole thing about COVID, if you look at the changes in our own industry, in the estate agency industry, and how we've coped and operated my own business, we were speaking off air earlier, how I've changed things in my own business, and that's happened. So these changes were happening anyway. What it's done, this paradigm shift, it's accelerated it. It's made it much faster, much quicker. So these changes were likely to happen over a 5-year period or 10-year period, and they're happening over a 1 or 2 year.
Yes. Period. Now, this podcast is all about buyers and sellers, Mike, and a lot of people are worried about the market. They're worried about this cliff edge, and understandably so. I mean, we've got here in London anyway, and many of the suburbs, the £500,000 is, we're going to hit that mark. It's, you know, the rest of the country, I know there are places where 250s actually buys you your average house. London's not one of them. It's more than double that, or at least double that. So we're in a situation where many people are heading towards that June, trying to buy and get it through. I believe that now it's unlikely, if you sell today, or if you try and sell today, that it will be through in time. We're just over 2 months. And as you know, in property terms, that's not a lot of time. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on post that deadline, because then we have the second deadline to September with the doubling to 250,000, offering a 2,500 saving as opposed to a 15,000 saving. That's a huge difference. And I wonder how you think that might impact the market, Mike.
Well, I think it will impact the market. I think it, you know, it'd be silly to say that it won't, because, and I think, as I said earlier, we've seen a concertinaing of transactions, so they've been bolstered in the short term, and they're bound to ease back. And in fact, we're already seeing an easing back in perhaps lesser numbers of properties coming to the market at this moment in time. So, yeah, you know, at the end of the day, it's not on the market; you can't sell it. So that will reduce things over time. But what we have also demonstrated is that there is a desire for people to want to get on with their lives, move, and make that happen. And quite frankly, whilst £15,000, which was the maximum you could have saved under the stamp duty holiday, you know, let's be perfectly honest, is a useful sum of money for anybody.
Yeah.
If you are making a life-changing decision, like moving house, on the strength of a £15,000 stamp duty holiday, then you need to have a good look at yourself.
That's fair comment, Mike. Yeah.
Because, you know, the average person now stays in a property for 20 years. Okay, so you spread that 50, even if it was 15,000, you spread that across 20 years. I mean, we're talking about this working out at about the price of a coffee once a week. Yeah. So is that going to stop you or make you make that move? Now, of course, you're going to take advantage of it if it's there.
Yeah.
You know, so which is why we've seen obviously a bit of a surge. But is it going to stop people moving in the future because it isn't there? I don't think so.
I don't think so either. I also think balanced against that, Mike, we've got the fact that we're coming out of the pandemic rapidly. The vaccine rollout has been tremendous, and I think that will bring confidence. On top of that, the thing that's really interesting to me is the new first-time buyer mortgages, because the ability to get mortgages on the bottom rung of the ladder will introduce a new range of buyer, because the buyer that's been missing is the seller of the 2-bedroom flat because they can't sell it. Because in our area particularly, and I know speaking to a lot of colleagues in and around London, flats have been the poor relation because there's no incentive for first-time buyers to jump in. On top of that, we've had Grenfell and many of the cladding issues, which has scared buyers away. And we're starting to see the resurgence of the first-time buyer. And I wonder whether those first-time buyers then buying those flats will introduce a new kind of range of buyer, rather than the person that's letting that flat to buy because they've got the equity. And many people that are trapped in those flats don't have enough equity to do that. But if they can sell, they can move. And I'm interested to watch that dynamic play out in the next few months.
Yeah, I think the everything you've said there, I concur with. I think the you know, the whole flat market has been, you know, difficult because first-time buyers, but also, you know, the cladding issue is still an issue. Okay, yeah. You know, things are happening now in terms of, you know, possibly a tax on developers to help fund it, because, you know, cladding, you know, there are people now stuck in properties that are very difficult or indeed possibly even impossible to sell. So we've got that issue, which is going to be with us, I'm afraid, for a number of years, because that won't just change overnight. So, but parking that to one side, if you just take the sort of economic elements of the thing, then actually people have got to, you know, people want to live somewhere. As I said earlier, I think there will be a movement back into towns and cities a little bit. So that will obviously bolster this. Part of the movement has been people wanting to get into green spaces and open air and whatever else. That will slowly dissipate a little bit, and that balance will come back. Interestingly, the government's just introduced a mortgage guarantee scheme, indemnity guarantee scheme, as you know, to facilitate 95% mortgages. Anecdotally, the take-up on that has not been that great. That is what I'm hearing from my clients, but it's very early days to see whether that happens. Because actually, at the end of the day, that extra 5% that you might be able to borrow, instead of 90, you can now borrow 95. I mean, obviously, you've got to pay for it at some point.
Yeah.
Interest rates on higher loan-to-value mortgages are generally higher than they are if you can put more money in. So it's actually going to cost you more money to do that. And bluntly, with the bank of mum and dad getting bugger all, excuse my French there, interest on their investments, it's cheaper to borrow it from mum and dad still. So this is a push to get more first-time buyers in. Same way as Help to Buy with developers and whatever, number of government schemes. In itself, is it going to be hugely transformational? I'm not so sure. Won't do any harm, but I'm not sure it's transformational. But people have got to remember, nobody's giving you this stuff. You've got to actually pay it back.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just think many people, we've got many tenants, for instance, that they're struggling to raise that 10% deposit. And if they can get away with a 5% and move, then they may well do it. But one of the things that's holding them back, I think, is an anxiety over, the EWS1 situation with the cladding. The EWS1, by the way, for listeners, is the form that's required to certify that a building is now fire safe. And once that's issued, then that's part of the problem out of the way. Of course, you still need to check whether there are ongoing costs in the service charge that need to be paid because it's been done. But actually, if you've got the EWS1, you know that the problems on the building have been dealt with and it's now fire safe. And I wonder whether as that comes about more, certainly we're finding the few buildings are now starting to certify, and that's good news, because a lot of the problem with flats has been along the lines of people being able to demonstrate what the future charges might be, and where they're not yet bedded down, buyers don't know what that means, and that gives a real problem with whether to buy or not. And inevitably, when there's that indecision over a service charge amount, people will go to another building, and that's a big pressure and much discussion in the larger blocks in and around our area. But for first-time buyers, Mike, if you're now advising first-time buyers, how would you see things? What do you see the market doing now? Do you think it's a good time for them to jump in?
I think if somebody wants to get on the housing ladder, as the expression is, when you can afford to do it is the right time to do it. I don't see any advantage in holding back if you can do it now. We're not going to, in my opinion, see any form of housing price crash as a result of any of this. We have in the past seen government interventions, and that boosts the market, and then the market has gone backwards for a period afterwards, after the sort of thing comes to an end. I think that the overall supply and demand equation, the fact that the economy is it looks set to grow quite substantially in the next
rapidly
year to 2 years, will actually all not necessarily fuel price growth, but it will certainly stop prices going the other way. So in that respect, if somebody's in a position to buy, now is a good time to buy. But again, the point I made earlier, people stay in their houses or properties for 20 years. Now, the average first-time buyer doesn't buy a property and then stay there 20 years. But I've been in my property for 32, so I'm not a good advocate for estate agents, really. But nevertheless, at the first-time end of the market, people probably stay 5 years or whatever it might be in their first property. And you need to look at it as that medium to longer term investment. If you're looking ever at getting into buying a property and moving out again in a year's time, your chances are, with the costs of entry, stamp duty and whatever else, costs of exit, agency fees and blah, 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 you're probably not going to make money.
Absolutely, I agree. That's what rental's for, isn't it? Short term is for rental. If you want to bed down your future and start moving things forward more permanently, then that's what property's for. I also think that, the great thing about having a low interest rate economy, and we don't suspect those interest rates will be going up anytime very soon at all, is that the people that are selling have more of a choice. We have less people on a cliff edge where they're saying, if I don't sell, I'm going to be repossessed. Especially because of Coronavirus Act, but also because interest rates are so low. Because, one of the things back in the 80s, when we had the big crash after the MIRAS deadline, the double tax relief deadline, was that we had very high interest rates. And those interest rates, coupled with the fact that rents versus your mortgage were actually lower. So you could actually run away from your property and these huge rates, and you could rent a property for half or a third of what you were paying in mortgage payments. Well, of course, now the reverse is true, and you'd be very lucky to get the property that you're currently buying or the mortgage that you've currently got in terms of a rental property of equivalence. So I think there's a lot of that about. What I'm finding a lot is when I'm going out and valuing properties, vendors, if they're not looking like getting the price that they'd anticipated for the property, and it's clear that's not going to happen, they're prepared to sit. And if they're sitting, that's not going to drive the market downwards, because that's just another piece of supply that isn't available to the market. And that is a sea change. Also with buy-to-let, obviously since the 90s, we've had buy-to-let, and buy-to-let's also been a sea change. We've got many pensioners now that we manage properties for and have done for years. And those rents are a very big part of their monthly income. And who would have thought it years ago? If you go back to the 80s, that was unheard of. That was a risk that no pensioner would ever take. And now it's a huge part of many people's daily economy in retirement. So, there are many different dynamics at play here, aren't there?
There are. I mean, you talk about buy-to-let. I mean, the assured short-hold tenancy, I think it was 1986, the AST came into play. Of course, before that, all tenancies were regulated, and therefore there were all sorts of issues about getting people out and whatever else. And so that changed the market. We now have a surcharge if you buy on stamp duty. We have a 3% surcharge if you buy an investment.
Yes.
If you a second property. But even so, of course, during this stamp duty holiday, with the discount or on the rest of the scheme, that still made some landlords look at the opportunity of increasing their portfolios.
Yeah.
Although there is also a trend for some landlords to be getting out. The legislation is pretty serious, and you certainly need to be using a good managing agent because of the complexities of it. But we have a government that is wedded to ideologically to home ownership.
Definitely.
And therefore, home ownership back in the 80s was up as high as about 70%, 72% of households were owner occupied. That fell to around about 60% a few years ago. It has now risen again to, I believe, to around 63, 64% and is on the rise. Yeah. And the reality is we need a mix of tenures. We need owner occupiers, we need a private rental sector, and we need a social rental sector.
Definitely. Yeah.
Because we need that flexibility for our workforce, for the way people live their lives, for the economic scenarios. Nobody's ever quite got that. There's no such sort of utopian position. But I think the balance is there or thereabouts. I expect us to run at, certainly somewhere 65, 70% home ownership, probably 20% private, and then the balance, 5 to 10% being social.
Yeah, and of course we have the new EPC rating of C coming up in 2025, which is going to be a requirement for all rented properties. And that is going to be a problem for some landlords that are currently rated E. I suspect in reality, what will happen is that there'll be some sort of cap where the government will say, well, you've got to spend a minimum of X on improvements, because it won't be possible for some of these properties to go from an E to a C without putting a windmill on the roof, which is not in planning anyway. So it'd be interesting to see how that plays out, because I think a lot of people will be thinking, hang on a minute, if I've got to spend huge amounts on my buy-to-let and the market is fairly good, you may find some people sell on that as well. But that's 2025. It's not that far away, 4 years away now.
No, it's not far away. And I think, the EPC standards, EPCs have been much maligned because they were originally associated with home information packs, which got a bit of a bad press, but shouldn't have done. Because we now would encourage people to try and get all of this information ready at the outset to speed transactions up. What are some, if we'd have kept home information packs and improved them, we'd probably have a better operating market today than we currently do. Yeah. But EPCs are important because energy costs and availability of energy. If you take a long-term view, and I'm not particularly known as a tree hugger or the rider of a whole mill bicycle, But I now have an electric car, for example. So
Yeah.
I have moved in that direction. But there are a lot of properties that won't be able to meet the standard. If you're in a solid wall apartment, you're on the top floor with a flat roof, outside walls, there's no gas to the building, this sort of thing, it can be very difficult for that property to achieve the appropriate rating. So landlords need to be perhaps now assessing where they are and taking a view on their future strategy as to what they're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And even for home buyers as well, Mike, I was with in fact, this is an interesting one. I was in a property in Mitcham, of all places, the other week, where we did a presentation video. Next thing you know, I've got an email from a Chinese Hong Kong lady. So I've just seen the video, want to buy it. And we were talking about EPCs, and I explained to her that it's an EPC rated B. And she said, well, what does that mean? I said, it means that your bills are £79 a month in sterling, which is about half what you could expect from most households. She's now buying that property. So EPCs, people often say, oh, they mean nothing, but there is an impact there. And with modern housing, it's a huge difference between the old houses and the new, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think in advising a buyer in particular, everybody talks about A, B, C, D, E, F as this rating, and not many people really understand what it means. But basically, it means that if you had the highest possible rating, which would be 100, it would mean that the property cost you nothing to heat and light a year. It would be 0. And then it works back from there. But what the EPC report do, it's not just those pretty little graphs that everybody sees. It's usually around about a 6-page document. And in it, it shows what improvements you could make to adjust the rating and reduce your costs. And that might be updating a boiler, it might be adding some insulation, various things.
Yeah. Some
of which are relatively cheap to do, some of which might be more expensive. But you will be able to calculate that the payback period on whatever that investment is a year, 10 years, whatever it might be. And people need to study these things, in my opinion, a little bit more closely, because they will have an impact, a growing impact, whether that's because of little Greta from Sweden or whoever it is. The simple fact is that the cost of energy is a big factor, and this can make a difference. I must admit, I've now got the best insulated loft space in South Buckinghamshire. I've got an electric car, cavity wall insulation, double glazing, blah blah blah. Now, a new condensing boiler. Now, I didn't suddenly rush out and spend thousands on this, but when I came to do some replacements, I made sure I did the best I could do at that point in time.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think mine's obviously not a brand new house, so I think I'm a B now in terms of rating, but it was an E, so it can make quite a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of just coming back onto that, the Hong Kong Chinese, I actually believe that there's quite a market there, Mike. I mean, we've got a lot of people out there that are in a very odd situation now. They realize the stark reality that the Chinese are taking over Hong Kong. It's no longer British, and it's no longer under pseudo-British rules. Is going to make a lot of those people come over. And of course, they've been invited. They have passports. They're welcomed with some support from our government as well. And it was interesting to see this buyer came along. And I wondered whether it's the first of many. And a lot of these people are highly educated. They have money. And I think we should welcome them with open arms. And it would be another dynamic for the housing market coming over to the UK there.
And they're also used to living in postage stamp accommodation. Because I've been to Hong Kong a couple of times, both under British rule and since China have been there. The price of property in Hong Kong is phenomenal because there's so little space. And an apartment. I mean, 99% of the population is living in apartments. So actually, that could and they're probably going to gravitate to London. Let's be honest, or certainly the major conurbations. So actually, and indeed, as we know, some of the major estate agency groups, the really big sort of global players, of course, they all have offices in Hong Kong, as well as in London. And there is, I work with one or two of these as clients, and they have got a lot of people now coming in from, the Far East, either Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. And taking up some of the shortfall that may have been there recently in the UK market.
Yeah. So if it was going back to buying at the moment, Mike, I think your advice was really good when you said that, look, 15 grand shouldn't be the decision why you buy or sell. The decision why you buy or sell should be driven by other factors, personal factors. And I say that all the time to people. I say, well, why are you moving? Don't move because your son tells you that you should move up closer to him. Move because you want to move. Are you comfortable? Are you happy? Are your friends around here? Because quite often I find people that are aging, they're in this dilemma where their son said, oh, you should move closer to us because we're here, we can look after you. And actually they don't want to move, And I always say, the fact that you're in a 3-bedroom house that you strive to pay for all those years, don't feel guilty about it. Enjoy it if you want to stay there. You shouldn't feel like guilty about that. I don't think. I know we need this transition to smaller housing for aging families in order to allow the new families in. But I also think, as you rightly said, that it shouldn't just be driven over, oh, there's this bargain stamp duty thing coming along or whatever the next fad is. It should be driven by, what makes you happy, what drives you as a family, what's right for you and your family. And you should be thinking about that in the longer term. Where do I want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And of course, property for many of us, that aspiration to start at the bottom and start creating wealth, because let's face it, it's a huge driver of wealth here in the UK, is a massive thing. And people dream and aspire to home ownership. And it's just about that timing. They're always worried, is there a good time? Is there a bad time? Well, if we look over the last few years, even in the last recession, it very quickly bounced back, didn't it, Mike? And anyone that bought before that recession, very shortly afterwards, just a couple of years afterwards, would have made a huge gain anyway, even if they bought in the depths of that recession there and bought at the wrong time at the height of the market. So I think longer term, it can be a good thing to get into for young people. And I always like to try and inspire young people to make that decision for the right reasons. If they're ready to settle in their lives and they've got the good, stable job and they're thinking maybe about family or maybe just about investment for their own futures, I like to, one of the things I like to do with this podcast is encourage people that this is good. This is something that works. Why it works is because what's the alternative? Well, rental, that's great. But actually, under the AST rules, you can be kicked out at very short notice. Okay, a little bit longer right now because of the courts and coronavirus. But, the long-term security that home ownership gives you is unmatched in the UK, really, by anything else, isn't it?
Absolutely. But it is a medium to longer term decision, as we said earlier. And people do need to think about it. It is apart from sort of, choosing to set up home with your lifetime partner or something, or who you hope is going to be your lifetime partner, it's as big a decision as most people take. So it shouldn't be taken lightly. The market does go in cycles a little bit. I'm sure there at some point in the future there will be a period where the market slows, downturns, or whatever. But the trend over any serious period of time has always been upwards. And we are, as a nation, as a world actually, but certainly as a nation, we are richer today than we were 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 60 years ago. There is a growing population for all sorts of reasons. We won't go into all the detail or whatever. Thankfully, we haven't had a war for 70 odd years, because we used to wipe a generation out every few years by having a war. And therefore there is a population growth, and we need to meet that in some way, shape or form. So the supply and demand on a very basic level means that the market looks strong. Doesn't mean to say it's always going to be flying and rising at ridiculous percentages every year, but overall the trend is strong. I wouldn't buy a property unless it was as an investment, but from where I was going to live, I would buy it because of what it gave me for where I wanted to live. You mentioned earlier about people moving, to the coast, and because their friends had said, "Oh, it's lovely here," or they were there on holiday. Of course, one thing that hasn't happened in the last year, there's not been that dinner table chat. There's not been that sort of dinner with your friends and talking about, "Oh, did you know my house price had risen by this?" That's true. So actually, that's gone in the last year simply because we haven't been able to meet anybody. So it'll be interesting to see, won't it? Once we can all start having dinner with each other again, whether suddenly people go, "Oh, crikey," and start moving on. No, I think the market is overall pretty stable. You know, there is an ethos of home ownership that is still there, and in fact being encouraged by the present government. But even if we saw a change of government, you know, they're not going to do anything that, in fact, you could argue that this government, until the COVID, had actually done a few things that were punitive to, certainly to investors. You know, still the market is strong. You can get a mortgage now up to 40 years. So if you want to cut, you know, keep the payments down, if you're a first-time buyer,
that's incredible, isn't it? That's crazy to have a 40-year fixed rate, but they are there. They are there.
You know, I mean, when I started, you know, 20, 25 years was the sort of, you know, length of a mortgage. Well, now, you know, my son's got a mortgage. I mean, he's paying, because he can afford to, he's paying more than he needs to every month. And so he's paying it down and cutting it down, which is great. But when he originally borrowed, he borrowed over 35 years in order to make it more affordable.
Yeah, this is quite common now as well, the longer mortgages. And why not? Because we're talking about such a long-term decision. You know, I always say to people, you know, one of the things about house prices, if you look at the big number, it doesn't matter where you're buying or what you're buying, it's always going to be damn scary. Always, without question. What you need to do is look at the little number, the monthly payment, because that's the only way you're going to get your head around this decision, and say, question, can I afford that amount monthly? That's the amount you should be fixing on. And when you're looking around the house, you should be having in your mind, this is 1,700 per month. Can I afford this house at that rate? And I think that's a better way to look at it, because you've got then a chance of getting your head around, because I always find people have a problem getting their head around the large numbers that we talk about.
Well, people often say to me, they say, well, you know, what's your house worth, Mike? I say, I don't know. They say, what do you mean you don't know? You're in the property market. Now, obviously, I have a rough idea what my house is worth. I couldn't care less what my house is worth.
Yeah,
I'm not selling it. You know, I'm sitting in it. I'm enjoying it. I'm living in it. What does it matter whether it's worth £1 or 20 million pounds? You know, now, it only matters when I come to sell it. And then it only matters as to what I'm going to do, you know, with buying another one or whatever. So it's the relativity that's more important than the sum of money. And I think, you know, of course I'm interested in how much my house is worth. You know, we all want the well-being and good feeling that it's, you know, gone in the right direction and whatever. But I can't spend it unless I sort of equity release or something. I mean, it's not as if that money's in my pocket so I can go down the pub with it. It's wrapped up in the bricks and mortars, but that's providing me with other things. So people need to just, you know, for their home, they need to be looking at it as a home. You know, fundamentally. You mentioned very briefly, I'll just go back on the stamp duty point earlier. You talked about people downsizing and whatever, and I'm getting towards more that end of the market than the first-time buyer end these days. And one of the areas I would like to see stamp duty reform. Okay, and one of the things that could happen is some form of encouragement in stamp duty levels or whatever, to encourage the empty nesters, to encourage people like myself, my wife and myself. There's the two of us now. We've got kids and grandchildren, but they don't live with us, thank God. No, we love them dearly. Dearly being the operative word. So we've got a fairly big house for the two of us.
Yeah.
Now, you know, we're not looking to move at the moment, but actually there's nothing to encourage me to free up this big family house and move to something smaller. So maybe one way of getting that market freeing up, which would free the market all the way down.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes sense. Yeah.
Would be to encourage by making some sort of stamp duty benefit for people at that end of the market, moving perhaps down. Some sort of relativity.
What you say makes perfect sense, Mike, particularly because many people in later years, of course, are on a fixed income, and that income's not very big. So their housing wealth is their only wealth. And if you make it easier for them to move, they're more likely to do it. So there is a lot of logic in what you say. The other thing I think you need to do, if you're buying and selling, and this is obviously commonly the thing, is I always say to people, the first thing you need to do is fall out of love a little bit with the house you're in order to allow yourself to make the move. You know, you've got to realize its shortcomings if you're going to move on, and then fall in love with something else. But whatever you do, don't fall in love with something else before you've fallen out of love and sold yours, because in this market particularly, agents are not going to wait for you to sell your house. So very important you do it the right way around. And I know many people will be saying, oh, but what if I sell and I can't find? Then you put your hands in the air and you say, hey, I'm really sorry, but I can't make the move. But the worst thing to do is find and then sell. Why? Because if you find and then sell, then the first thing is the agent, knowing that you're not in a strong negotiating position, will push you on the one you're buying to maximum asking price or way above. And B, the first offer that comes along, you'll probably take because you're so in love with a new house. So I think it's important we do these things in the right order, Mike, don't you?
Yeah, you're basically putting yourself in a stronger buying position by doing that, and therefore, that makes absolute sense. And I think people, if you are, for example, I talk about downsizing. I'm by definition that means I would be buying a smaller property. What do I do with all my stuff?
Yeah, this is a big problem for people. Yeah,
and there's a lot of it. So I need to plan that about what am I going to do with all this stuff. And the same way when people are selling at any part of the market, decluttering is part of the process, either because it's just cathartic to get rid of all this stuff you've accumulated, but also presentationally, you need to present a property in such a way that it is more neutral. So that I don't walk in somewhere and see you living there. I walk in there and I can visualize myself.
Definitely. Yeah, agreed.
And so people, there's more to this than slinging it on the market, putting it on Rightmove or on the market or Zoopla or whatever at a price and hoping that, somebody comes along. It's a big move, but it's one that can be done successfully using a good agent like you, Ken, and, taking that advice. You've got a lot of experience. But people need to think about it. It's not a spur of the moment thing, in my view.
No, absolutely. No, Mike, you've been great. Thanks so much for coming on today. You've been a wealth of information, and it's been great diving deep into the UK property market. The last thing I'll say is I still believe that an Englishman's home is his castle. I think we're different in that way. I think we're bred differently. We're bred to think about property in this way, and it's ingrained. And that's one of the reasons why I think the UK property market will always be a fascination and an inspiration for people,
I agree. You've only got to go into Europe. And of course, here in the UK, I've said that home ownership is about 2/3 of ownerships. It's the reverse in Europe.
Yes.
In Europe, it would be 2/3 rented, 1/3 owned, for example, in most of Europe, whereas it's the other way around here. So there is a fundamental difference to how we're set up. And you talk to kids in school and college, what they aspire to, maybe less so than they were 20 years ago, but nevertheless, property ownership is still high up the aspiration list. Rightmove, Zoopla, the portals, 99.8% of people who visit those portals don't buy.
Yeah.
Okay. Most of the visitors are looking, they're aspirational, they'd like to, but for whatever reason, they don't. And that shows you where the supply and demand is. There is a huge desire, an aspirational wish to move on, move up, or whatever.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said about dinner party conversation, because, of course, one of the big topics of dinner party conversation these days always was really property. Okay, perhaps we've got Bitcoin and some other flashy, shiny things as well. But property has always been that dinner table conversation, hasn't it? Oh, by the way, did you realize that property prices and my price and my neighbor and everything else? And of course, we haven't had those dinner party situations. So it's interesting. That's fed into this dynamic as well, no doubt. To what degree it's hard. It's not a tangible thing, but it's interesting to know.
Absolutely. And a few years ago, I did some research and people move house. And something like 60% of people who move house buy a new car within a year. And now, whether that's because they've taken some equity out of the deal in order to fund that, whether it's because they need to keep up with the Joneses because they've moved into a smarter neighborhood and they now need a Mercedes on the drive rather than a Vauxhall or whatever it might be. Nothing against Vauxhall, but it does drive all of these other activities. Okay?
Yeah, definitely.
So, one of the reasons the government has obviously, put a lot of effort into keeping the housing market open, bolstering it with stamp duty holidays, mortgage indemnity guarantees, it drives so much of the economy. New kitchens, new bathrooms, carpets, you name it. A lot of it gets driven out of the housing market.
Yeah. And I also think that the 250,000, the doubling of the stamp duty up to September was no mistake, because at that time, the average house price was around 250 in the UK. And so obviously, politically, from a government perspective, they're not going to pee off the majority of the country when the first deadline goes, because there'll still be full relief for many people in the UK. It may not apply here in London or the suburbs, but there are many places where it will still apply and there'll be no duty.
No, that's a good point. I mean, the reality is, I mean, the standard level is 125,000, as you know, and it's going to run at 500 until the end of June and 250 September. 250 is the average house price in the UK. So there's a huge number of people buying who don't pay any stamp duty at all anyway.
A little bit more than that now, Mike, probably driven by the fact that they've got the
Have you been out overvaluing, Ken?
Mike, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much, Michael Day, for coming and joining us on the Property Buyers and Sellers podcast. Stay safe and well, everybody. We'll be back next week with another edition.